Yani modern Türkiye üzerine yazılmış bir kitap. Ama onun dışında hani Osmanlı iktisat tarihiyle ilgili makaleleri yazıp yayınlamaya devam ediyor. Bize anlatacağı, yani bize esayen ettiği bir makale, aslında 2004 yılında yayınlanmış makale. Yani üzerinden neredeyse 20 yıl geçmiş, o da inanılmaz bir şey. Ama hala bana sorarsanız temel argümanları açısından ve verdiği çerçeve açısından hala iktisat tarihinin en sık referans verdiği makalelerden bir tanesi. Onun üzerine konuşuyor ama dediğim gibi çerçeve geniş. Yani sana dersin şeyini göndermiştim Şevket, outline'ını. Yani dersin outline'ı baştan çok böyle iddialı falan başladık ama oradakinde biz büyük bir kısmını yapma şansımız olmadı. Yani senin konuşman bir parça bize fırsatı verecek. Şimdiye kadar yaptıklarımızı ve bundan sonra yapacaklarımızı derleyip toparlama şansı verecek. Onun için sözü sana vereyim.
Onur, görüyor musunuz
evet,
ekranda?
Görüyoruz. Gayet güzel görüyoruz.
Slide'ı görüyorsunuz.
Evet.
Peki.
Ama durum böyle.
Peki. Ben İngilizce konuşacağım sunuşta ama başta Türkçe bir iki söz söyleyeyim. Onur Hoca'ya teşekkür ederim beni davet ettiği için. Onur Hoca'nın söylediği gibi bu dönem İngiltere'de Oxford'dayım. Buradaki canlı iktisat tarihçileri grubu hocalarla birlikte çalışıyoruz. Ben kendi yaptıklarımı burada anlatma fırsatı buluyorum. Bugün ekranda başlığını gördüğünüz this presentation today that you see on your screen is a paper I presented last week here at Oxford. It's a broader presentation than the one I published in 2004. Okay. What I hope to do today is to offer a framework for inserting the Ottoman Empire into the bigger picture in the early modern era, where this empire stood in relation to the rest of the world economy. And I take seriously the concept of empire, and my argument will be mostly in terms of empires in the early modern era. In recent years, in the last 30, 40 years, the literature on empires, the literature on institutions, and institutions of empires has developed considerably. There has also been a lot of empirical findings on the early modern economy, on various economies during the early modern period. And of course, there has been considerable progress in economic history of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, all of these have been supported by, have interacted with the debate that Kenneth Pomeranz initiated when he published his book, The Great Divergence, arguing how, when exactly, and to what extent Western Europe diverged from the rest of the world economy, and especially from the economy of China during the early modern period, whether it was early modern or in the 19th century. In this debate that's been going on for the last 20, 25 years now, the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East have not been represented very well, have not been represented very strongly. So I am hoping that my perspective today will help us better understand the Great Divergence, how the Great Divergence, the concept of Great Divergence applies to our region, to the Middle East. And through this all, I hope to also provide an overview of the political economy of the Ottoman Empire and its economic performance during the early modern era from a comparative perspective. At the outset, I should point out that I made a conscious decision not to focus on the 19th century today. I feel that the story for the Ottoman economy or for Indian economy, for economies of Latin America and so on, or for the economy, for that matter, of Russia and so on, non-European economies, the story for the 19th century, this basically the story after the Industrial Revolution, is better known and in many ways similar for many parts of the non-European world. I have in fact written, and Onur Hoca's he mentioned already my recent book on the economy of Turkey in the 19th and 20th century. I've written about the 19th century, but I feel that early modern era is equally, if not more interesting, because in the early modern era, the political economy and institutional change in the Ottoman Empire still depended mostly on local forces, and the outcomes were more open compared to the 19th century. The 19th century, by the 19th century, Western Europe and the rest of the world are diverging, and they are very unequal in power, economic strength, political strength, military strength, and so on. This was not the case in so much in the early modern era. And I feel that the early modern period is much more suitable for learning how Ottoman institutions, how Ottoman economic institutions functions. So again, my focus will be on the early modern era from roughly from 1500 to 1800. I'll begin by summarizing my main argument today. First, I want to make a distinction between empires and nation states, or rather, I want to emphasize that not only because we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, and which is an empire and not a nation state like Turkey, which is a very different entity. An empire is a very different entity than a nation state. But in fact, if you look at the world map, you see, and I made this simple calculation, that in the 18th century, more than half of the world population, in fact, lived in empires. And in the 19th century, if anything, an even higher share of the world population lived in empires. So if we want to talk about the early modern era, our unit of analysis should be the empire. And secondly, I want to make a very basic distinction between early modern empires. There were two kinds of empires in the early modern era. First were the European overseas empires. They increasingly became, in the 19th century, European overseas colonial empires. But the second category are the land-based empires, these empires covered areas, did not have overseas colonies, but they ruled over different groups, different ethnic groups. And my argument, and of course this the category of land-based empires included the Ottomans as well. Thirdly, economic structure, political economy, and institutions were quite different in these two types of empires during the early modern era. And I'm going to expand on that. I'm going to argue why. And these contrasts between the two types of empires are quite useful for understanding each one of them and how they evolved over the early modern era, and also for understanding where the Ottoman Empire stood in world history and in the early modern era. I say these because, in Turkey, there is a school, a tradition of historiography that says we are not like any other society. Biz bize benzeriz. We are like ourselves, and so there is one school that refuses to insert the Ottoman Empire into a comparative perspective in the early modern era, and I want to argue in part against that. Where should we put the Ottoman Empire in the early modern era? Exactly what are the similarities and contrasts with other empires around the world? And of course, these distinctions will also give us insights into some other questions in historiography. Was the Ottoman Empire, of course, in some of these things are quite popular, especially in Turkey, about whether the Ottoman Empire was on its way to capitalism before the 19th century. What role, another question again, very popular question, what role Islam, or more specifically Islamic law, may have played in the trajectory of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and so on. So my distinction today and my emphasis on the contrast between these two types of empires, I hope, will shed light on these kinds of issues. Continuing on my main argument, today I will provide evidence that while there exists some variation within each type of empire, these empires' political economy, economic structure were quite different. More specifically, in the European overseas empires, share of trade in both in GDP, like let's say overall size of the economy, and also share of trade in state revenues increased steadily during the early modern centuries. And the political economy of these empires, overseas empires, European overseas empires, was shaped increasingly from the 16th through the 18th century by the relation between the merchants and the state. So the main axis is between the merchants and the state. And I take the merchants very seriously because I feel that in the early modern era, the merchants and their relations with the respective states was a key dynamic. merchants not only did trade, not only provided provisionings, food supply, raw material supply for the urban areas, but they increasingly organized production, they increasingly organized agricultural production, they increasingly organized manufacturing production in urban areas, and increasingly with the power they gathered, and then through their relations with the state, they were able to change institutions in their societies, and that also meant a very powerful role, historical role for the merchants. So I take that seriously. And in contrast, in the land-based empires, agriculture accounted for a much larger share of the economy, and the central axis of political economy was between the state and the local elites. The central axis in the land-based empires, the central axis of political economy was taxation of agriculture, the extraction of the agricultural surplus. And here, the local elite, the relation between the state and the local elites mattered hugely, as we know from Ottoman history as well. However, given the technological limitations of the early modern era, these land-based empires faced a very large, uneven geography, and distance remained a major obstacle to raising state revenues and to raising state capacity. There is this famous saying for the early modern era, the tyranny of distance. Well, the tyranny of distance applied to all societies and applied to the collection of taxes from agriculture. It was very, very difficult, and this is where this dynamic between the state and the local elites come into question. So we find, as closely related to A and B, closely related to the role of the contrast in the role of trade and the contrast in the role of agriculture in the two kinds of empires, we find that during the early modern era, state revenues and state capacity and then GDP per capita diverged between the two types of empires. State revenues, state capacity, and GDP per capita tended to increase in the overseas empires, while they moved mostly horizontally and in some cases even declined in the land-based empires. So I feel that this contrast between the two kinds of empires in the early modern era tells us a lot about the Ottomans, the Ottoman economy, the Ottoman trajectory during the early modern era. In other words, Ottoman Empire belonged to a group of empires, land-based empires, that faced much more difficult constraints. And it was this economic structure, this political economy, that helps explain the Ottoman economic trajectory during the early modern era. And I would argue it's not Islam, it's not Islamic law that mattered, but this particular configuration, a land-based empire. Okay. So in my talk, I'm going today, in the remaining of my talk, I'm going to make some observations about early modern empires and their political economies, their institutions. And then I will go further into the contrast between the two types of empires. I will contrast the role of merchants and trade policies in these two types of empires. And then I will also focus on the land regimes, and I will focus and elaborate on the common challenges of land-based empires, including the Ottoman Empire. And I will then provide some evidence on the divergence of state capacities in these two kinds of empires during the early modern era. And all of this will be accompanied, or towards the end, I will then insert the Ottomans and what we have learned empirically about the Ottomans in the last, say, 30 years. I will present these empirical findings to emphasize how the Ottoman economy fared and how, in what ways it was similar to, and in what ways it differed from other land-based empires during the early modern era. Now, a few words about early modern empires and their institutions. We all know that, well, each empire has a center where where its central administration is, central government, and then there are provinces or the periphery. Well, these empires are often led by elites at the center. But the key to the cohesion, stability, and longevity of the empires was, in fact, the relationship between the center and the provinces. All empires and all the central governments in all empires needed to extract resources from the provinces. And for that, they had to manage their relations with the elites and intermediaries, as well as the direct producers, the peasants and the guild members in the provinces. And then they needed to co-opt and collaborate with the local elite. So this center-province dynamic remained key to the political economy of all empires. Briefly again, institutions are the political and economic arrangements, and or, as Douglas North calls them, are rules of the game. My view of institutions in empires is that because many empires faced similar constraints, there were similarities between the institutions, economic institutions of empires. Each empire, including the Ottomans, did not really invent these institutions, whether they are the land regime or the guilds or the monetary system or institutions related to tax collection. Each empire was familiar with the institutions adopted by other empires. So each empire, at the end of the day, chooses from a menu of possible similar and possible institutions. And of course, each empire faces a slightly different geography, a different culture, different history, and a little bit different political economy. So the choices of each empire may be a little different. But there were many similarities as well, and that's the point I want to make. So I will begin with some basic evidence that accumulated in the last 10-20 years. I've also worked with these statistics. I have published on them, and I continue to work on statistics concerning state revenues in the early modern era. These statistics are not very precise. They are approximate. They provide a range rather than a precise number, but they nonetheless point to major differences between the two kinds of empires. Here is my summary figure contrasting the two kinds of empires based on my reading of a lot of data from the revenues of these different empires, the two kinds of empires. When I say, okay, the top two lines refer to the overseas empire, European overseas empires, and when I say European overseas empire, there are 5 of them I focus on: British Empire, the Dutch Empire, French Empire, Portuguese, and Spanish. You see that in the early modern era, revenues from land and agriculture varied between 25% and 45%, but on the whole, the share of these revenues was decreasing. In contrast, for these 5 overseas empires, and there was some variation between them, the share of state revenues or revenues of central administrations related to trade range from 30% to 55%, and they were increasing during the early modern era. Share of trade is increasing, share of land and agriculture is declining. So you could say that this economic structure and the role, the changing shares of trade and agriculture in state revenues also had an impact on the respective political economies. In these overseas empires, merchants are becoming increasingly more important, trade is becoming more important and more influential. In contrast, in the land-based empires, again, you see from the last 2 lines here on this figure, state revenues from land and agriculture accounted for a larger share of state revenues, ranging from 50 to 75% of total revenues. And the Ottoman Empire is also in this category. Most of state revenues come from land and agriculture. In contrast, revenues from trade in the Ottoman Empire and in other land-based empires is very small, relatively small, between 10 to 20%, and contrast that with the revenues from trade in overseas empires, which ranged from 30 to 55%, and it was rising during the early modern era. So this is a huge contrast, and I'll further elaborate on that and how that affected the political economy in the two kinds of empires. The political economy of European overseas empires, which were later named the European overseas colonial empires, is a better known story. We're more familiar with how these European empires worked. Trade accounted for a larger and rising share of GDP and state revenues, and merchants played key roles in these empires. Again, as I mentioned earlier, not only supplying urban areas, but also organizing production, agriculture production, manufacturing production, and increasingly, as they became more powerful, as their relations with states developed, as they became more influential, merchants were changing institutions on the way to capitalism. And this is the way, I think, this is the way to see how what the roles merchants played in the early modern era. They were not an industrialist as we know them today, did not exist for most of the early modern era, but they emerged towards the end of the 18th century. And I would say that in these overseas empires, European empires, a major innovation emerged, a major innovation in political economy. Until this period, states tried to help merchants, but this symbiosis between states and merchants in the European overseas empires had never been reached in earlier periods. States in the early modern overseas empires supported trade, supported merchants. They also supported merchant shipping, commercial shipping for trade. These states played a key role in the competition for the control of trade routes across oceans. And increasingly, states use their navies to fight against each other. These European empires fought against each other, but they also fought to open markets in the Middle East, but to a much greater extent in Asia and so on. Fernand Braudel has a very important saying. He wrote, "Capitalism is triumphant when it is identified with the state." When it is the state. And this symbiosis between the state and the merchants we reached a new level in the early modern era. And I want to show you an additional graph how um, how trade mattered and what role trade played in the rise of state revenues during the early modern era. This is based on work I did together with Kıvanç Karaman, and we published a number of articles, including one on the Ottoman Empire on state revenues during the early modern era. You can see how during the early modern era, in these five empires, in the, let's say, in the center regions of these five empires, state revenues not only rose, but they rose as a percentage of GDP. So I could go and argue further that it was trade, growing trade, that made it possible for these states to collect a higher percentage of GDP as taxes. And one of the key insights of economic theory and economic history in recent decades is the role of state capacity in economic development in the rise of capitalism during the early modern and the modern centuries. States, the argument made by economics and economic history is that states play key roles in providing public goods. Public goods meaning not only domestic security, not only external security, but law enforcement, but also macroeconomic stability, a stable monetary system, institutions that support markets, and so on. So states play the key roles in the rise of capitalism in the early modern era. And that was possible because state capacity, the state's capacity to deliver these public goods was increasing during the early modern centuries. Now I'm going to contrast this with the political economy and institutions of land-based empires. And when we say land-based empires, I'm already mentioned, I'm thinking about the Ottomans, but I'm also thinking about China, Russia, of Mughal India. Türkiye'de, this is known as the Mughal Türk Hindistan Devleti, and the Safavid Iran. These, there were here is a map of those five empires, from Russian to the Chinese, the five empires. I do not include the Habsburgs in this category because the Habsburgs were until the end of the 16th century were also included the Spanish Empire. So they belong to another category for part of the early modern century. But the other, I would argue that the other five land-based empires in this map, in many ways, faced similar constraints, had similar structures, faced similar constraints. You can see that their population size is very different. China and India were much larger. Mughal India is much larger. And then Iran is smaller, Ottoman Empire and Russia is in between. But also notice that there is whereas population in China and India are rising during these centuries, both because of expansion of the empire, but also because of internal population growth, population size in the Ottoman Empire remained roughly constant during the early modern period. And this was not only because of a shrinking of Ottoman's borders, but also because Ottoman population did not grow in the core regions. Here is our Ottoman Empire here, and you can see that Ottoman Empire experienced many border changes during the early modern era and then also in the 19th century. But equally important, there were many changes in the status of the different regions. Not all these areas were ruled directly by the center. There was indirect rule, sharing of administrations, and so on. I'll go into that. But let me begin with a contrast between Ottoman trade policies and the status of merchants in the Ottoman Empire with those I already discussed with the role and status of merchants in overseas empires. Now, to be sure, Ottoman merchants were quite active, both domestically and abroad. And Ottomans also made attempts in the 16th century to control the trade routes in the Mediterranean and then also in the Indian Ocean. But they were not very successful. They were not successful in the Indian Ocean. And in the following centuries, the contrast between Ottoman trade policies, other European overseas empires, and contrast with mercantilism became stronger. Most importantly, we know from the literature, and also we are reminded every day by what President Trump is trying to do in the United States. In mercantilism, exports are favored over imports. In the Ottoman Empire, trade policies were quite opposite to mercantilist policies. The Ottomans tended to favor imports over exports. The Ottomans often put restrictions on exports, but they welcomed imports. Trade was seen as a source of provisioning, of iaşe, more food supply. More imports meant more food supply, for more food and goods, consumer goods supplies in urban areas. So Ottomans, rather than restricting foreign merchants, Ottomans provided privileges, kapitülasyonlar, privileges to foreign merchants in Ottoman markets. Well, this was also the case. These privileges existed in medieval Europe as well. But by early modern era, all European governments were busy supporting only their own merchants and creating obstacles against foreign merchants. So Ottoman policy again was in direct contrast to mercantilism. Ottoman Navy, merchant shipping, Navy remained relatively modest. And most importantly, even if they had some interest in this at the end of the day, in the 17th and 18th centuries, Ottoman government was unable to, and did not provide any support for Ottoman merchants, whether they are in European markets or they're in other markets like in India. There were Ottoman merchants, some in Europe and some in India, but they often operated without the direct support of the Ottoman government. And I would say, again, a contrast, Ottoman merchants were really not part of the Ottoman ruling elite. Ottoman merchants had more room to grow, more room to flourish in the provinces. Recent books for example, by Nelly Hanna show how there were rich merchants in Egypt and some of them were trading with India. And perhaps because they were away from the Ottoman central government, they had more room to expand. But elsewhere, Ottoman merchants, especially those around Istanbul, capital city, they could function, but they were really not part of the ruling elite. And during the early modern centuries, increasingly there emerged this divergence between Ottoman merchants and European merchants. In Ottoman markets, European merchants became increasingly more powerful. And one part of this explanation may be but this is a complicated story, but we are all familiar with the fact that Ottoman merchants were most often non-Muslims. But there is also a good deal of continuity here when we look at the status of economic elites in Turkey or in the Middle East today. We see that economic elites are never really part of the ruling elite in Turkey. In fact, in Turkey, as you know, the economic elites may find themselves often in prison, let alone being part of the ruling elite, let alone being part of the political elites. So there may be some continuity there. Finally, I want to come to the common challenges of early modern land-based empires, and I will focus now, having contrasted trade policies and the role of trade in the two kinds of empires, I want to move to agriculture and tax collection. In the land-based empires, agriculture is much more important than trade, as I argued, and the relations between the center and the elites and intermediaries in the provinces remain the central axis of political economy. We know that from the Ottoman Empire as well. The relations between the center and the Ayan in the 17th and 18th centuries is the central axis of Ottoman political economy, and it's similar in China, it's similar in Mughal India. And these land-based empires were not able to increase their tax revenues during the early modern centuries. It remained difficult to collect taxes from agriculture, the tyranny of distance again, and the relations with the elites in the provinces could be reasonable, could be good, but there remained serious constraints. Here is a graph. Again, with Kıvanç Karaman, gathered the data based on some of the work by other economic historians. You can see, in contrast to the previous in contrast to this graph on tax collections by the central governments of European overseas empires, you can see with the same axis, vertical axis, central government revenues in land-based empires were not rising, and they were not really rising as a percentage of GDP during the early modern era. This green line is the Ottomans, and you can see before the 19th century, it's mostly horizontal, and so is the Chinese revenues and Mughal India revenues. Russia seems to be, in the 18th century, seems to be somewhat of an exception, but it's still in the land-based empire category. We know from recent work on Ottoman history that Ottomans were very skillful in engaging with the elites in the provinces. The Ottomans were pragmatic, the Ottomans were flexible, and they constantly negotiated with local elites and the intermediaries to be able to continue to collect taxes and keep the empire together. And this engagement, constant negotiation with local elites, is really the key to Ottoman Empire's longevity. After all, the Ottoman Empire is one of the longest running empires in history. And the key here is constantly engaging with the local elites. And the Ottomans were successful with that. However, and we could also see that Ottomans were quite flexible and pragmatic with respect to other institutions, monetary institutions, tax collection, public finance, credit, and so on. There was always some influence of Islam on Ottoman institutions, but there was also a great deal of pragmatism. And when some of the more rigid rules of Islam came in the way, Ottomans were able to circumvent those rules with a great deal of pragmatism. But at the end of the day, there was limits to this pragmatism and flexibility. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the rise of Ayan, especially in the 17th, 18th centuries, the rise of Ayan in the provinces meant that Ottoman government at the center was not able to increase its revenues at center, and state capacity to provide these key public goods remained limited, remained mostly horizontal. I've shown this graph showing how state revenues remained horizontal, the green line, during the early modern centuries. This graph shows Ottoman state revenues at the center, Ottoman state revenues per capita, in other words, revenues per population divided by the daily wage in Istanbul. It shows that state revenues during the early modern centuries equaled 2 to 4 days of wages, but no more. 2 to 4 days of wages in Istanbul. That shows again that the Ottoman state revenues did not increase very much during the early modern century. So I'm going to wrap up, conclude here by again reminding you that I identified 2 types of empires in the early modern era. And the economic structure political economy and institutions of these two different types of empires was quite different. One favored trade and merchants, the other focused on taxation of agriculture. These differences are quite useful for understanding each of these empires and their divergence in the early modern era. And of course, divergence also occurred between these two kinds of empires with respect to state revenues and state capacity. I think these contrasts between the two types of empires help us understand the Ottoman economic trajectory during the early modern era. And also Ottoman political economy. I will stop here.
Şevket orada nasıl bilmiyorum ama bizim öğrenciler sabırsız. Gene bir saat fazla, bir saat civarında iyi sessiz sedasız dinledi herkes. Şimdi şöyle bir şey var.
Bir saat olmadı ama 45-50 dakika oldu galiba Onur. Tamam. Okey.
Çok güzel oldu. Yani bizim derste konuştuğumuz birçok konuyu sen açmış oldun. Aslında birbirine de bağlamış oldun. Tam aslında şey açısından, konuşma açısından hedefe ulaştık diye düşünüyorum. Şöyle bir şey yaptık Şevket. Yani aşağı yukarı buraya gelen herkes sana sormak için soru hazırladı. Bir kısmı bayağı kazık sorular yani, onu söyleyeyim. Aynı şekilde şeyde olan, online olan arkadaşların da bir kısmı soru hazırladı. Şimdi yani doğrudan sorulara geçelim mi yoksa bir 5 dakika dinlenmek ister misin?
Ben iyiyim. Sen ama soruları sen bana iletsen, belki istersen gruplandır, istersen teker teker, whichever way.
Şimdi şey olmasın, danışıklı dövüş gibi olmasın dedim Şevket. Onun için soruları hepsini ben print ettim ama içinden seçmedim. Ama şimdi burada yani öğrenciler kendileri cesur bir şekilde gelip soracaklar. Gayet güzel formül etmişler. Eğer soruları aklarına gelmezse ben de zaten çıktıları var, ben veririm. Şöyle yapalım diye düşündüm. Doğrudan konuşmayla ilgili ve makaleyle ilgili soruları alalım önce. Ondan sonra belki genel iktisat tarihiyle ilgili birkaç soru olabilir. En sonunda da daha böyle contemporary, bugünkü meselelerle ilgili sorular olabilir. Yani 3 grupta soru yapalım dedim. Yani sen ne kadar dayanabilirsen o kadar soru sorarlar diye düşünüyorum.
Ben iyiyim.
Tamam.
Ben dersin süresinin sonuna kadar benim için uygun.
Tamam. Yani o zaman yani sorularınız gayet güzeldi. Cesur bir şekilde sormaya başlayabilirsiniz. Hiç çekince göstermeyin. Eğer aklınıza gelmiyorsa sorularınız çıktı olarak bende var, benden de alabilirsiniz. Ama yani fırsat elinize geçmişken iyi değerlendirin derim ben. Başlayalım mı? Makaleyle alakalı ve şeyle alakalı. Alper sen sorup gidebilirsin. Şevket sorular zor olabilir. Ona göre hazır ol yani. Hazır ol.
Hocam,
Şimdi
hocam zor soruları sormasanız olmaz mı?
Ya,
Çok zor olmasın sorular.
Şimdi Alper'in soracağı soru aslında bir parça Alper sınava gideceği için şimdiden sormak istedi. Daha çok 3. gruba giriyor ama sorsun istiyorum.
Peki, tamam.
Merhaba Şevket Hocam. Öncelikle teşekkür ederiz sunum için. Çok güzeldi, çok keyifliydi. Ben soruma geçeyim. While the regional inequalities inherited from the Ottoman Empire have transformed the east and west of Anatolia into two different worlds, not only on the map, but also in the rhythm of development, can the development policies implemented today really close this century-old gap? Or is modern Turkey continuing its development race with the invisible chains of the past?
Okay, thank you. This question relates to a recent article we published last year on regional inequalities in Turkey, published in Economic History Review, since the late Ottoman era. And this paper argues that unlike what most people assumed, these regional inequalities within present-day borders of Turkey did not emerge during the 20th century, during the Republican era, but go back at least to the last half century of the Ottomans, and we find out also even to earlier periods. So, my first response to your question would be that I think our historical perspective suggests that this is a deep-rooted problem, and that it will not be simple to overcome these big regional differences. However, we should also recognize that at the root of these differences are the political conflicts. And today too, that if the Kurdish, Turkish, PKK, however you name it, this conflict, this military conflict, is today at the center of the economic problems of Turkey's east. If a peaceful resolution of this conflict emerges, I think that would be a good beginning, a major beginning for closing the gap between Turkey's east and west. But again, my conclusion is that the political issue is very important. It will go a long way, but it will not end the regional differences. So, but political resolution of the conflict is the best way to go forward.
Thank you hocam.
Cem. Böyle bir şey gibi, lise gibi. Tamam, doğru. Söyleyeceğim.
Bunun için çok teşekkür ederiz hocam.